started with a simple idea: save money on electricity. That's all I wanted. So I did what a lot of people are doing these days. I installed solar panels. Clean energy, lower bills, and a smart investment in the long run. Nothing fancy, nothing controversial. Just a decision that made sense. The panels went up without any issue. I didn't need a permit from anyone special. I owned the property. No HOA. No rules to follow. Or at least that's what I thought. A few weeks after the installation, I noticed something odd. There was a letter taped to my front door. It looked official, but not from the city. It was from the local Homeowners Association. The name was unfamiliar to me. I stood there, reading it over twice. According to them, my solar panels were a violation of their neighborhood rules. They claimed I hadn't submitted an architectural review form. They said the panels needed to be removed immediately. I almost laughed. I wasn't even part of their HOA. I double-checked my property documents just to be sure. There was no mention of any HOA. I bought the house specifically because there wasn't one. I didn't want to deal with rules about grass length, mailbox colors, or when I could paint my fence. That's why I chose this neighborhood. It was supposed to be free of all that nonsense. But the letter was very real. And what came next was even more unbelievable. 2 days later, I got a certified mail envelope. Inside was a formal notice of legal action. The HOA was suing me. Not just sending threats, actually filing a lawsuit. The claim: non-compliance with neighborhood standards and unauthorized modification of exterior property. Couldn't believe it. I called the number on the notice. The woman on the other end spoke like this was all perfectly routine. When I told her I wasn't part of the HOA, she simply said, "Our records show your home is within our extended jurisdiction." Extended jurisdiction? I had never even heard of that before. I asked for proof. She said I'd receive it in discovery. That's legal talk for, "You'll find out once we're already in court." It was like being sucked into a nightmare that made no sense. I wasn't breaking any law. I wasn't in their territory. But here they were, dragging me into court like I had vandalized a park or set up a junkyard in my backyard. I started researching everything I could find. Forums, legal blogs, news articles. Anything about HOAs going after homeowners outside their boundaries. I was shocked by what I found. It's more common than you'd think. Some HOAs expand over time, absorbing nearby homes or claiming jurisdiction based on outdated documents. Others just bluff, hoping people will fold and comply out of fear. The stories I read sounded crazy, but now I was living one. People were getting fined for things like planting the wrong flowers or putting up a flag. Some were sued for parking in their own driveways, and most of them didn't know how to fight back. That's when it hit me. I couldn't just ignore this. They were counting on me to back down, counting on me to feel small and powerless. But I wasn't going to make it that easy for them. Something about the way they handled it, the arrogance, the assumption that I'd just roll over, it lit a fire in me. I started keeping records, emails, photos, everything. If they wanted a fight, I wasn't going in blind. I knew I needed help. This wasn't just some neighborly misunderstanding anymore. This was turning into a real legal battle, and I wasn't about to take any chances. So, the first thing I did was call a real estate attorney. I explained the situation, from the moment I installed the panels to the bizarre lawsuit from an HOA I had no connection to. He listened quietly, taking notes, then asked for my property deed, closing documents, and anything that mentioned neighborhood covenants or restrictions. A couple of days later, he called me back. His tone was half amused, half serious. "You're not part of that HOA," he said. "There's nothing in your paperwork that ties you to them." That's what I thought. But he also warned me not to underestimate them. HOAs can be persistent, and if they've been operating under the assumption that my home is within their boundaries, they might actually believe they're right. Or at least pretend to be, just to keep control. I started digging into the history of this HOA. I wanted to know who they were, who ran it, and where they got their power. That led me to a local Facebook group, neighborhood issues, complaints, the usual drama. But then I found a thread about boundary creep. Apparently, this HOA had been expanding over the years. Slowly, quietly. sometimes even without official documentation. One homeowner mentioned they got a notice just like I did years after moving in. They fought it too, and eventually the HOA backed off. But not without a lot of pressure and public attention. This confirmed what I suspected. They were playing a game where fear, confusion, and silence worked in their favor. They hoped most people wouldn't fight back. They hoped I'd panic and remove the panels just to make it go away. But not me. I wasn't going to let them win that easy. The next thing I did was contact my solar panel company. I asked if they had dealt with situations like this before. The rep told me yes more than once. In fact, he mentioned that some neighborhoods are known for HOA overreach. He even offered to send documentation showing that my panels were approved by the city and installed legally. He told me the panels were within code, not visible from the street in a disruptive way, and didn't violate any known ordinance. I asked him to send every bit of paperwork he had. I wanted it all in hand. If I was going to court, I needed to walk in prepared. Still, the anxiety didn't go away. Every time I pulled into my driveway, I'd glance at the mailbox, wondering if another notice was waiting. Every unfamiliar car parked on the street made me wonder if it was someone from the HOA taking pictures or gathering evidence. That kind of stress builds fast. Creeps into your day, makes you second-guess everything. But I didn't let it stop me. I used it. I turned it into fuel. Then something unexpected happened. A neighbor from down the street came by. She had heard about the situation through the grapevine. Apparently, someone on the HOA board had mentioned my case in passing. She said, they tried the same thing with the people 2 blocks over. Tried to say they were in the HOA too. She gave me a name. I reached out to that family. Sure enough, their story matched mine almost exactly. No real connection to the HOA, but still hit with threats and paperwork. They'd pushed back, and eventually the whole thing fizzled out. That was the moment I knew I wasn't alone. I wasn't just fighting for my own home anymore. I was standing up against something bigger. Something that had been going on quietly for too long. It didn't take long before I realized this fight was going to get uglier. The HOA wasn't backing down. Instead of admitting they were wrong, they doubled down. I got a second letter in the mail, this one more aggressive. It claimed that not only were the solar panels a violation, but I was also now being fined daily until I removed them. They put an actual dollar amount on it, $100 per day. That's not something you just ignore. The letter was full of bold words like non-compliance, violation, and legal remedy. They made it sound like I had done something criminal just for putting panels on my own roof. They even threatened to place a lien on my property. That part hit hard. I hadn't done anything wrong, but now they were acting like they had the power to take my home away from me. I called my lawyer again. He wasn't surprised. He said this was a classic tactic: threaten with fines, throw in legal jargon, and hope the homeowner gives up before things get serious. He filed a formal response on my behalf, stating clearly that I was not part of their HOA and that their attempt to enforce rules on a non-member had no legal standing. We sent copies of my title deed, the neighborhood plat map, and the solar permit approval from the city. Everything was documented, neat, and by the book. Then came the silence. No reply from them for almost 2 weeks. It was eerie. I kept expecting the next shoe to drop. And it did, but not the way I imagined. A guy in a polo shirt and sunglasses showed up on my porch one afternoon. He didn't introduce himself right away, just asked, "Are you the one with the panels?" I told him yes and asked who he was. He finally said he was a representative from the HOA board, here to have a conversation. I said I wasn't interested in casual conversation and that all communication should go through my lawyer. He didn't like that. Before leaving, he said something strange. He said, "This could all be avoided if you just cooperate." That word stuck with me. Cooperate. Like I was supposed to be guilty until proven innocent. Like doing what they wanted, even if it wasn't legal, was the easier path. And maybe for some people it is, but I wasn't going to set that example. Not for myself. Not for my neighbors. I started talking to more people on my street. Quietly, casually. Just asking questions. Turns out, several of them had their own horror stories. One had a flag they were told to take down. Another got a notice for having the wrong kind of mailbox. A third was fined for parking a pickup truck in his own driveway. All of them said the same thing. The HOA acted like they owned everything, even outside their actual boundaries. One neighbor, an older gentleman who'd lived there for 20 years, told me the HOA didn't even exist when he moved in. It was formed later by a group of homeowners in a different section of the neighborhood. Over time, they started claiming authority over more streets, more houses, more rules. But no one ever voted on it. It just happened. That's when I realized how important it was to push back. This wasn't just about solar panels anymore. It was about who has the right to tell you what to do on your own property. The law was on my side. The facts were on my side. But none of that mattered if I stayed silent. I had to make noise. I had to show them I wasn't going away. A few days after that strange visit from the HOA guy, something new appeared on my property. A printed notice, staked into the edge of my front lawn near the street. It had the HOA logo on it, and a big red word stamped across the top, "Violation." Below that, it listed my address and claimed I was in breach of aesthetic regulations. No signature, no name, just an official-looking document placed on my lawn like some kind of public warning. That was the moment I realized this was getting personal. Felt like intimidation, like they wanted the whole neighborhood to see I was being punished. But instead of feeling embarrassed or ashamed, I felt something else, determined. I wasn't going to let them bully me into submission. I took pictures of the sign, pulled it out of the ground, and saved it with the rest of my documents. I wanted every piece of evidence if this thing ended up in court. I also started keeping a log. Every interaction, every visit, every letter. I wrote it all down with dates and times. I learned quickly that documentation was power. HOAs are good at acting like they have authority. But once you put their actions under a microscope, that authority starts to fall apart. That same week, I got an email from someone I didn't know. They said they lived in another nearby neighborhood and had heard about my situation through a local community forum. Apparently, I wasn't the only one going through this. The same HOA had tried to enforce rules on several streets that weren't even listed in their founding documents. Some people had ignored the letters and never heard from them again. Others had complied out of fear, but no one had actually taken them to task until now. I decided to speak out. I didn't want to sit in silence while this happened to others. So I wrote a detailed post on a community message board. I explained everything: the panels, the false accusations, the lawsuit, the visit, even the violation sign. I didn't name names or get personal. I just laid out the facts. Within a day, I had over a dozen replies. People were shocked. Some were angry. A few were even grateful because they had been confused about their own HOA status and didn't know what to do. One reply stood out. It was from a woman who said she used to serve on an HOA board in another part of the city. She said, "They can't enforce anything on you without legal authority. If your deed doesn't tie you to them, their rules don't apply." That was exactly what my lawyer had said. Hearing it from someone with experience gave me even more confidence. But with all that attention, the HOA started to act differently. Suddenly, I was getting emails instead of letters. More friendly in tone. No more threats, at least not in writing. They wanted to set up a meeting to resolve things amicably. I forwarded everything to my lawyer and ignored the invitation. There was nothing to resolve. They were in the wrong and they knew it. Now they just wanted a way out without losing face. The quietness that followed was almost louder than the threats had been. No more signs. No more notices. But I didn't trust it. I had read too many stories online about homeowners who thought the battle was over, only to get hit with another legal notice months later. I kept my guard up. Every time I pulled into my driveway, I scanned the area. I didn't feel totally safe in my own home, and that's not something anyone should have to deal with just for going solar. The silence didn't last long. One morning, I opened my mailbox and found a thick packet of documents. Legal paperwork again. This time it was an official court summons. They were moving forward with the lawsuit. Not just threats, not warnings, but a real court date. They wanted a judge to force me to remove the panels and pay fines for non-compliance. My first thought was disbelief. They had all the proof that I wasn't part of their HOA, and they were still doing this. But then I remembered they were counting on me to be scared, to fold, to settle just to avoid the stress. I took the documents to my lawyer right away. He reviewed everything, calmly flipping through the pages like he'd seen this 100 times before. When he looked up, he said, "They're bluffing, but they've put it on paper, so now we fight it on paper too." We filed a formal motion to dismiss the case based on lack of legal standing. Basically, we told the court, this HOA has no authority here, and they know it. We included every piece of evidence, my deed, my neighborhood map, city permit approvals, and copies of all their previous threats. Waiting for the court to respond felt like time had slowed down. I went about my normal life, but it was always there in the back of my mind. It was exhausting mentally and emotionally. I didn't know how long it would drag out, and I wasn't sure how far they were willing to go. But I also knew that giving in wasn't an option. I thought back to all the stories I had read online, all the people who had caved because they felt like they had no choice. I refused to be one of them. Meanwhile, something surprising started to happen. Other neighbors, some I barely knew, started stopping by when I was outside. They'd say things like, "Heard what's going on, that's crazy," or, "We've had weird issues with them too." One guy even told me they fined him for putting up a small shed in his backyard, even though the city had already approved it. Another said he was warned about painting his front door a color that wasn't in line with the neighborhood theme. Even though there was no such rule in writing, people were frustrated. Most of them didn't even know if they were officially part of the HOA or not. That was the issue, nobody had clarity. The boundaries were vague. The rules were inconsistent. And yet this group kept acting like they owned everything. The more I talked to my neighbors, the more I realized I wasn't just fighting my own battle. I had unintentionally become the face of a bigger issue in the community. A few of us started meeting up informally, just to share stories and compare notes. We dug into public records, plat maps, old HOA filings, anything we could find. What we discovered was eye-opening. The HOA had never updated its official boundaries, and there were clear lines on file with the city that showed which houses were included and which weren't. Mine wasn't. Neither were several others they had tried to control. It was all right there in black and white. They were hoping no one would ever check. We made copies. We started building a file. It wasn't just about my case anymore. It was about accountability. If they were going to abuse their position of power, someone had to expose it. And now we had the proof. I could feel a shift happening, like the balance of control was beginning to move. The fear they counted on was starting to fade, replaced by something stronger. A community that had finally opened its eyes. When the court date finally arrived, I wasn't nervous like I expected to be. I was ready. I had everything in order: documents, maps, city permits, the legal description of my property, even screenshots from the county website confirming that I was never listed under their HOA. My lawyer walked in confident too. He told me this was exactly the kind of case that gets thrown out quickly when the facts are this clear. Still, it was surreal walking into that room over solar panels. Something meant to help the planet, something I was proud of installing. The HOA had a representative present. He didn't say much, just handed over a stack of printed rules and claimed I had violated them. What stood out, though, was that not a single document tied those rules to my house. They were vague, generic, not even signed or updated. Just pages of rules pulled from a binder with no real connection to my property. My lawyer pointed that out first. He stood before the judge and laid out everything. He showed my deed. He showed the neighborhood plat. He explained how HOAs are limited to properties that are explicitly written into their charter. No guesswork. No assumptions. If it's not listed, it doesn't count. Then he presented the solar permit from the city, fully approved, with inspections passed. And finally, he showed the violation notices, the threats, and the attempt to fine me for something outside their authority. The judge listened quietly, asked a few questions, then turned to the HOA rep and said something I'll never forget. "Can you show me where, exactly, this homeowner agreed to be under your jurisdiction?" The guy flipped through his paperwork, mumbled something about neighborhood unity, and then admitted he didn't have that proof. just that my home was in the vicinity of the HOA's territory. That wasn't good enough. The judge didn't even need to take a recess. He ruled right there. Case dismissed. The HOA had no legal authority over me or my property. Their attempts to fine me were not only invalid, they could potentially be seen as harassment if they continued. I didn't smile. I didn't cheer. I just felt relief. Months of stress, threats, and legal games, all because I chose to use solar energy, and it was finally over. At least the court part was over. But walking out of that building, I knew something else had started. Word spread fast. I didn't post anything online, but people in the neighborhood started talking. One by one, folks who had stayed quiet began stepping forward. Some asked for help figuring out if they were actually part of the HOA. Others wanted to share their own run-ins with the board. A few were just curious how I stood up to them and won. So I started putting everything together. All the maps, letters, and emails I had saved. I organized them into a file that anyone could use. I handed it to neighbors who needed it. I sent it in emails when people asked questions. I even suggested they consult my lawyer if they ran into trouble. I wasn't trying to start a war, but I was done pretending this wasn't happening. Then something unexpected happened. One of the current board members resigned. Quietly, no explanation. Just a short note sent to the group saying he no longer wished to serve. Not long after, another one stepped down too. It was like the pressure had finally gotten to them. Or maybe they realized people weren't going to stay silent anymore. Whatever it was, the board started to change. Not officially, not all at once. But the tone shifted. The threats stopped. The friendly reminders disappeared. And the most surprising part? A few of the new people joining the board reached out, asking to understand what went wrong, what the limits of their power were, and how to avoid repeating the same mistakes. Even though the court had dismissed the case, I kept watching my surroundings carefully. Part of me still expected some kind of retaliation. I had pushed back against people who were used to getting their way without question. And just because they lost in court didn't mean they would stop trying other ways. I wasn't being paranoid, just cautious. That's what this whole experience had taught me. You can do everything right, follow the law, and still be targeted if someone decides you're a problem. But as days passed and nothing happened, I started to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. I didn't have to check my mailbox with anxiety. I didn't have to scan my lawn for strange notices. I could simply live. And I could enjoy the thing that had started all of this in the first place: my solar panels. Every sunny day felt like a small victory. Not just because I was saving money, but because those panels represented independence. They were a symbol that I didn't need permission to make smart choices for my home. Neighbors continued to reach out. Some just wanted advice. Others had their own legal questions. One couple invited me over for coffee and showed me a notice they had received about their landscaping. They weren't sure if they had to comply or not. We pulled up the same property records I had used and confirmed that they too were outside the HOA's actual boundary. That notice? Completely unenforceable. They were relieved and maybe a little shocked. I had felt the same way when I first realized how flimsy the HOA's claims really were. Eventually, a group of us started meeting more regularly. We weren't trying to cause drama, we just wanted to understand our rights. Some people had questions about permits, others about dues or architectural guidelines. We even invited a local real estate expert one evening to explain how HOAs are formed, what makes them legal, and how they can and can't operate. That meeting turned out to be one of the most informative moments in this whole experience. People left it feeling empowered. What surprised me the most was how many people had assumed they were stuck. They thought HOAs were untouchable. That once an HOA told you something, you had to obey it, no questions asked. That fear had kept them silent. But now they were asking questions. They were checking their paperwork. They were reading the fine print. And that shift was bigger than anything I could have done alone. Some residents even brought up the idea of forming an official non-HOA neighborhood group. Nothing with authority, just a community-driven way to share information, look out for one another, and help with problems before they became legal battles. It wasn't about rules. It was about connection. After all the division the HOA had caused, people wanted something different. Something human. One man, quiet, retired, always kept to himself, stood up at one of our meetups and said he'd lived in the area for 30 years and had never seen neighbors come together like this. That stuck with me. It made everything I went through feel a little more worth it. I had started this fight thinking it was just about me and a few panels on a roof. But it had turned into something bigger, something unexpected. It had exposed cracks that had been there for years, hidden under the surface. And now, the same people who once felt powerless were standing together, asking questions, sharing resources, and making sure no one else had to go through what I did just to protect their home. As the weeks went by, life slowly began to feel normal again. The fear that used to hang in the air started to fade, replaced by a strange mix of calm and curiosity. I still looked at my solar panels every morning when I pulled out of the driveway, but not with anxiety anymore, with a kind of quiet pride. Those panels had become more than a home upgrade. They were a reminder of how far I'd come and what it took to stand my ground. One afternoon, I noticed something different while driving through the neighborhood. A few houses, ones that hadn't had solar panels before, now had them going up. I slowed down, not sure if I was seeing things. But no, they were definitely installing panels. I didn't know the homeowners personally, but a few days later, one of them walked by while I was in the yard and stopped to say hello. He thanked me, said my situation gave him the push he needed. He'd always wanted solar but thought the HOA wouldn't allow it. Now, he realized he had more rights than he'd been told. Stories like that started popping up more often. People who had felt boxed in were beginning to make choices on their own terms. Not recklessly, but thoughtfully. They were checking property lines, reading their deeds, and confirming the facts. All because one person questioned something instead of just following along. It wasn't a movement, not officially, but it felt like a shift. Quiet one, but real. I also began getting messages from people outside the neighborhood. A post I had made months earlier on a community board kept resurfacing. More homeowners from other parts of town. Some with completely different HOAs were going through similar issues. One man said he was being fined for having a rain barrel. Another said her HOA told her to remove a raised garden bed because it disrupted the uniformity. A woman in a different city said they were trying to charge her retroactive dues, even though she had only lived in the home for a year. It was eye-opening. My story wasn't rare, it was just rarely told. Most people didn't have the energy or resources to fight back. And many of them didn't want conflict. They just wanted to live peacefully in their own homes. That's the part that stuck with me. The fact that something as personal as your home could be turned into a battlefield if the wrong people were given too much power with too little oversight. I spent time answering as many of those messages as I could. I wasn't a lawyer, but I shared what I had learned. I sent links to public record sites, explained how to look up deeds, and reminded people that fear doesn't always mean you're wrong. It was never about revenge for me. I didn't want to tear anything down. I just wanted the truth to matter. Eventually, I realized that if something good was going to come from all this, it wasn't just about panels or permits. It was about information. The more people knew, the less likely they were to be taken advantage of. I even started writing a simple guide, a one-pager with steps to take if your HOA overreaches. No legal jargon, just real steps anyone could follow. I shared it in forums and community chats. A few people offered to translate it into other languages. Someone even suggested printing it and dropping it off at neighborhood events. It didn't matter who you were or where you lived. This was about standing up for your space, your choices, and your rights. And once people saw that they weren't alone, something changed in how they carried themselves. The same people who used to look down or whisper when they got a warning letter were now asking for copies of maps, contacting city offices, and helping each other understand what was really going on.